A pleasant good afternoon to everyone joining us from around the region, and a very special welcome to CIVIL's webinar, a multi-stakeholder approach to promoting child rights and protection. I am Dilys McDonald, coordinator at the Caribbean Women in Leadership. It is truly an honor to welcome you to this webinar and to bring greetings as we commence this very timely and critical conversation on our children. As many of you are aware, CIVIL is a non-partisan and independent flagship networking organization committed to advancing women's transformational leadership and to increasing the numbers of women in leadership and decision-making in political and civic life. Conversations on women and child's rights are extremely important to us at CIVIL because we, like you, understand the need to create spaces for further dialogue and to promote advocacy on these very important issues across the region. Today, we will delve deeper into child rights and protection in the Caribbean. We recognize that the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals, prioritize the rights, safety, and freedom of our children. However, the reality is that children throughout the world and here in the Caribbean are denied access to many of these rights. Equally important is the perspective that we often problematize children rather than seeking to address the societal and other factors that impact their lived realities. During today's discussion, we will speak on the status of children in the Caribbean, particularly in terms of their access to their rights as set forth in the Convention, the prevalence of violence against children, operations of social protection systems for children and their caregivers, and the role of civil society in supporting and protecting children. I would like in advance to express our gratitude to all presenters who will share their wisdom and advocacy for improving the lives of our children. I would also like to express gratitude to each person present on Zoom, as well as on our Facebook live stream, because your passion, desire for justice, and commitment continues to forge significant impacts in our community and in the region. Once again, a very warm welcome to you. I will now hand over our session for today to our moderator, Marcus Kissoon. Marcus is a Trinbagonian activist who has worked alongside the women's movement for over a decade. His areas of interest are sexual assault, domestic violence, HIV, migration, and child sexual abuse and exploitation, safeguarding, and children policies. His research centers Caribbean masculinities, Indianness, and the implications for disclosing and seeking help amongst male survivors of child abuse. He holds a Master's of Science in Gender and Development Studies from the University of the West Indies, and Kissoon was a member of the 2021 Independent Investigation Team looking into absconding and abuse in state and private homes in Trinidad and Tobago. This further influenced his research as a Chevening Scholar, where he did a Master's of Arts in Women and Child Abuse Studies at London Metropolitan University. Over to you, Marcus.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that introduction. Well, important. I want to just start off by saying that children make up a huge contribution, and their existence in this world is important for us to start off with by understanding that they're there and they live very interesting lives and they experience the world way different from adults. Hence the reason why this conversation is so important. All countries in the Caribbean are parties to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, an international agreement which came into force in 1990 and set out the civil and political and economic, social and cultural rights of every child, regardless of race, class, ethnicity, religion, and abilities. And the convention defines a child as every human being below the age of 18 years, unless otherwise indicated by national laws, giving some room for us to think about our children and their own particular developments within that space. Yet many countries around the globe and in the Caribbean fall short of fulfilling their rights. In almost every country in the world, children are more likely to live in poverty than adults. This is true for the Eastern Caribbean, where in every country in the region, child poverty was higher than adult poverty, with rates such as and ranging from 7.2% in Angola to above 50% in Grenada. So, it's important as well that we understand that many girls and boys in the Caribbean are not growing up in safe environments and are exposed to a level of violence and abuse. In a current regional UNICEF report, a statistical profile of violence against children in Latin America and in the Caribbean, published in 2022, finds that almost two in three children aged 1 to 14 in the region experience violent discipline at home. And that's quite interesting because we see that with the data coming out of the Children's Authority and in Trinidad and Tobago, where that sort of corporal punishment has had high numbers in the reporting since its establishment in 2015. So according to other research, 20 to 40% of girls in the Eastern Caribbean area has faced sexual abuse. Up to 70% of our children have experienced some form of physical violence or psychological abuse. And I think I want to just also share that in Trinidad and Tobago, young males are disproportionately represented as both perpetrators and victims of homicide. It was noted that gang-related homicide has increased by 400%. This was found in around 2011. The same gender and power systems, the patriarchal system, that make women and children victims of harmful masculinity and violence are the same systems that put young men and boys in positions of perpetrator and victims. And I feel like today is an excellent opportunity for us to unpack those interesting experiences the Caribbean has been facing, both pre and post-colonial times, and what we know to be happening to our children. So I'll take this time to introduce our panelists, and I'd like to start with Ms. Faith Marshall Harris. Mrs. Faith Marshall Harris is an attorney at law, legal consultant, vice chair of the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child, and chair of the Barbados National Committee on the Rights of the Child. She was educated at Queen's College, Barbados, and is a graduate of the University of the West Indies, Mona, Jamaica. She pursued postgraduate studies in the University of Geneva, Switzerland, and served for 11 years at the Barbados High Commission in London. I think also in her bio that I think that is so relevant right now is that in 2018, she was elected by the UN General Assembly as one of 18 child rights experts from around the world to sit on the Global United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child for the period of 2019 to 2023, and was re-elected to serve from 2023 to 2027. She's the only member from the Caribbean, one of 3 from this hemisphere. Faith, Mrs. has devoted the last 20 years to the upliftment, protection, and defense of children, and maintains it is her life's commitment. And we thank you for your service as we start off. I'd also like to sort of introduce Ms. Diane Gordon Harrison. Mrs. Diane Gordon Harrison is the Children's Advocate of Jamaica and a national rapporteur on trafficking in persons of the Office of the Children's Advocate. In her earlier years, she was a student of history and law at the University of the West Indies. She is an attorney by profession and has previously served as Deputy Director of Public Prosecutions in Jamaica for 9 years. It was this experience that prepared and motivated her to advocate for the rights of vulnerable people in Jamaica and eventually take up the post of Children's Advocate, where she has proactively working for over 11 years to promote the rights of children. And we'll learn more about her as we go along. And last but not least, I'd like to also introduce Mr. Matthew Batson. Batson is a UNICEF child-friendly space coordinator and a clinical psychologist passionately working in Trinidad and Tobago. Child-friendly spaces are a key programmatic intervention for UNICEF, often used during and after natural disasters and emergencies. In Trinidad and Tobago, Matthew works to support out-of-school children to access these spaces, promoting and streamlining interagency referral pathways, standard operating procedures, and core programming that is holistic and safe for children. In Trinidad and Tobago, out-of-school children are largely migrant and refugee children from Venezuela who are unable to access national systems and require structures that support access to mental health, psychosocial support, safe and trustworthy adults, and peer engagement to heal, develop, and thrive. You know, interesting and very much what we're trying to do here. I'd like to start off the conversation by asking the team, in no particular order, of course, what is the status of our Caribbean children? What do we know about their lives and their experiences that has influenced a protective thinking and safeguarding culture right now? What do we know? Anyone wants to go first?
All right, Marcus, good afternoon to you and to everyone who has virtually joined us, and of course, to the esteemed members of the panel, of which I have the privilege of sharing. So I think I'll speak from the Jamaican perspective virtually, but also in what we have done just by virtue of observation in relation to what's happening in the region. And what I think has been particularly certain is that children throughout the Caribbean are at risk, some more than others, but violence against children continues to be a leading issue. In your opening comments, for example, Marcus, you referenced the findings that spoke about children being certainly at the community level as well. We have a lot of children from the Jamaica who are featuring, unfortunately, as victims of very serious. Can you hear me? I think my connection.
I can hear you now. It was a bit of distortion earlier. So yeah.
Sorry about that. Yes, I was saying that certainly we're finding that children continue to feature as victims of serious crime. And when I say serious crime, they range the full spectrum, from murder to acts of sexual violence and other forms of physical violence. And of course, we are finding that there is a ricochet effect. So apart from being physically impacted, there is the connection with the psychological and psychosocial needs that become evident as a result of these violations. Just last week, for instance, we had a direct kind of perspective from children directly about how these acts of violence impact them. And for 2022, we had 2,345 children reaching out to us at the Office of the Children's Advocate through our Child and Teen Helpline, saying that they had self-harming behaviors and suicidal ideations because of the exposure to violence and other things which negatively impacted them. The other issue which continues to be a very great feature, therefore, is the mental health crisis that's impacting our children. I think that has always been there, but this has perhaps been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, where we saw a lot of children through the input of UNICEF that did a very quick kind of rapid response roundabout in 2021 that surveyed 500 households that had children, and they indicated in very clear terms that they were having mental health issues from mild to severe. So anxiety, fear, apprehension, clinginess, etc. And know that isolation, so it is not an issue whereby, becoming reintegrated into a formal structure is creating problems within the context of the school environment. So in summary, violence against children is a great issue, mental health issues, and also family and peer relations that feed into the psychosocial needs are issues that we're seeing from the Jamaican context.
Thank you so much for that, Ms. Gordon Harris. I see you shaking your head, Ms. Marshall Harris.
No.
Where you sit,
No,
where you sit though, are you seeing any common trends within your region when it comes to children's safety and experience with violence and abuse?
oh, no, I would agree with all of that. I'm not shaking my head at all at that, that summary. In fact, though, I would like to go back to a sort of root cause. And I find that the root causes that I am seeing in the Caribbean is the lack of recognition that children have rights. That in fact, I think that a lot of what happens to children thereafter is because there seems to be some block, some barrier to the notion that children are the subject of rights. And I just want to go back to something that you said in the introduction, and that is that we are somehow within, especially in the Caribbean, and I must tell you that, I am involved in doing the reviews of countries across the world. So I have an opportunity to compare, and I can see very clearly from a distance, really, where the Caribbean, has to start thinking. And one of the things that we have to remember is the children of today are the creators of our countries tomorrow. And unless we get what they're bringing right, we are going to be more or less consigning our countries to poor leadership, lack of productivity, citizens who are not invested in the country. So one of the things that I've been trying to sort of preach is that this actually, the question of how we treat our children, how much we recognize their rights, how much we listen to them, is really vital to the future of our nations. If we don't do that, we won't have a country. So what I usually start with is that I find that a lot of what happens to children, whether it's violence, physical, whether it's verbal abuse, psychological abuse, all stems from the notion that these are not right. These are not subjects of right. So, well, I can't speak necessarily for the entire Caribbean in terms of the exact attitude, but I can tell you in terms of the few countries that I've visited, you get this sense that we still see children as people, more or less an appendage of adults. And therefore, what happens to them it has nothing to do with what they have a right to. In fact, right now in Barbados, a conversation is going on that is really upsetting me a great deal. And that is that there is a feeling that if you talk about children's rights, for some reason, you are negating parents' rights. And I have been saying over and over again that actually children don't have rights unless we recognize that parents have rights. And in fact, they are, interlocking. And I've been trying to explain that the CRC speaks to parents' rights up front. The first thing that it says is that we recognize, respect, and promote parents' rights. And basically what the CRC is doing is saying, but where parents need our help, where they fall down, where they fall short, the state must provide and ensure that these children have what they need, of whatever it is they need, whether it is a feeling of safety or if it is a material need, whatever it is, the state must be there. And one of the things that I've also found very strange is that a lot of what we're saying now has been practiced in our countries from beginning, you know, in the sense that what we are doing, what has happened in 1990s, that we really codified a lot of basic values that was contained in our laws and our constitutions. And what people have to understand is that children are the subject of human rights. They're just little humans. That's all. They deserve to be respected as all humans are. And so if we can get that message across, we will start to be able to get them to say, well, you can't knock this child about simply because you say you've brought this child into the world. You can't decide that this child doesn't have a say because you feel, well, as someone said to me, I feed this child, I clothe this child so they will speak when I want them to speak. That is a pervasive attitude. I don't want to speak for all countries, but certainly for some of the Caribbean countries that I know, that is an attitude that if I can just get that out of our system, we will start not a lot of the abuse that children are subjected to, a lot of the neglect, a lot of that would eventually resolve because we would begin to understand that these are human beings who deserve to be treated with all dignity, respect, and to be heard.
Yes, Ms. Marshall-Harris, I think you have really allowed for us to tap into some of the cultural and social understandings of how we understand children and their position in relation to adults. And in my own work, I've been thinking about what Kivel calls adultism and adult-centrism, and how that has been rooted in how we think about children, how we value them, and then the sorts of access they have to being part of functioning societies. You're quite eloquently said to think about adult power versus children's role and place in relation to that adult power. I think that was a really good, interesting take on it. And Matthew, from where you sit at UNICEF, what are we missing in terms of understanding the status of children in the region in relation to their protective and safety needs?
Thank you. So, Marcus, before I directly answer what you said, I want to echo what my fellow panelists have said, and it is very difficult to go after you, Mrs. Marshall-Harris. You took every single word that I could possibly think of, and you really put it out there in a way that so strongly resonated with not just what UNICEF believes as an institution and in attempting to make the kind of global change that we try to make, but also me as an individual. I really resonated with what and where this conversation is going. I even see in the chat already that we have a lot of persons who seem to really resonate with what is being discussed. And I want to say that, you know, I do see that perception and that misperception of this idea of what a child is. And we often do think of them in kind of separated ways, and that we think of them as I think we heard words like appendage. We're seeing words like objects in the comments, you know, just words that really take away the humanity of persons. And I think historically, when we look at, and my fellow panelists have all studied history much more than me. So historically, when we look at this, we know that that is always a first step towards some serious injustices. When we begin to take away humanity from a group of people, we really see that slippery slope starting to happen. And it's important for us as a society, especially as we're already seeing so much violence towards and around children, that we take those proactive steps because we know what history has told us can and will happen. And something I think is really important for that narrative is I like to remind people that these systems are just systems that we put in place. They are just structures to uphold particular things that we all believe are true. And we all believe that children have, or more accurately, particular lifespans, particular ages are developmentally more appropriate or suited towards particular activities. And we know that time spent feeling safe, secure, connected to yourself, your community, and those around you, that it leads to better outcomes in life. And so we as a society have put these structures in place to affirm that But a lot of people get really caught up on the technical definitions and, well, this is my child and I am a parent and I have this right. But the reality is we are all humans. And it is our understanding of best practices that has kind of led to us saying, hey, well, let's put that into governance and leadership. Let's put that into systems and society. But when we pull back, we're still all just people, right? We're all very similar. And the more that we can eradicate those negativities, is the stronger that we can put these children on developmental trajectories that mean much more for us as a society. In terms of what UNICEF is seeing and what we pay a lot of close attention to, the situation is quite a worrying one for us. And I remember that earlier we spoke about, kind of the rapid pro systems that UNICEF uses to get just a rapid assessment of what is happening within a country or within the region. And some of those snapshots from our data that we do know is that across the region, 1 in 3 children are living in poverty. When we do test children, on average, 60 to 70% of children will tell us that they've experienced physical or psychological violence within the month prior to the survey. So it is not even within their lifespan. It is very relevant to the here and now. At any given point in time, over half of children will say that. In terms of sexual violence, we know that more related to adults. We know that 1 in 3 is pretty much the global and even the regional average for women that have experienced sexual violence. And that means something for families. That means something for society, and it means something for our women and girls. In terms of child sexual violence, we found that over 57% of the general public agree and maintain that child sexual abuse is a major problem that we need to put emphasis towards. But what we see conversely to that is our young people, nearly 1 out of 3 adolescents are overweight, and 1 out of 5 are considering attempting suicide, with 25% of that being girls and 14% of that being boys. And of course, we see intersectoral connections as well, because all of these things, they really mean something when we look at how an individual develops and how a system is meant to build to protect them. So we also see challenges within education systems and the need to strengthen their resiliency. So within the OECS member states, in 2017, only 29% of students passed CXC subjects that would include English A and mathematics. And we see a youth unemployment rate across the region at 26%, which is 3 times that for adults. And then in terms of what would be called NEETs, so those are persons neither in education, employment, nor training. We see across the OECS subregion that 22% of our youth are in that population. And when we look at this entire thing as a snapshot, one of the worrying things and trends that we are closely monitoring to see what are some of the ways that UNICEF can support is we see a social protection coverage that is not matching up with the need within the communities. So we see that over the region, only about 80,000 individuals benefit from national social protection programs across the Eastern Caribbean. And 170,000 primary and secondary school students receive assistance, be it school feeding programs, textbook loan schemes, those types of systems. But then we go back to the fact that 1 in 3 children are living in poverty. So the proportion of what we as a society are able to put in place for that resiliency and that support is also something that we're seeing not being met at the level that it needs to be met at. And it does mean that we need to think more about how that multi-stakeholder approach, how we all contribute together. So for us at UNICEF, that's kind of where we are seeing both in terms of our coverage, as well as where we are seeing some of these critical gaps for intervention and data gathering coming forward.
Thank you, Matthew. I think that was a really nice background as to some of the realities of children in the Caribbean. I want to just ask the panelists, if we were to use this subsection, this community of children, migrants, children who move across the region for particular reasons, for crippling economies, fragile economies, etc. And the levels of vulnerability, well, firstly, what are the levels of risk and vulnerability that migrant children experience? And what does that tell us about, one, our ideologies about valuing children, looking at that particular group of children, and what do we want happening at the family level, the community level, the institutional level, and then the legislation and policy level. So we're looking at migrant children who move across, who have language barriers, who have less access to safety and language and all of these different things. What do we understand about our Caribbean society as we look at these stateless children, so to speak, these migrant children and the vulnerabilities that come with it?
Sorry, could I just jump in here, because I want us to be very clear on our terms. And as you know, from where I sit in Geneva, we have a very specific approach. We will say to you that there are no migrant children, actually. We hardly ever use the term. We think of children in situations of migration. You know why? Very few children get up one morning and say, look, I'm going to try and migrate. They are taken on these journeys of migration by adults. And so I think this is one of the things that we keep putting before governments, that when you see a child who is in a situation of migration, that child has really probably had no part of that decision making. Well, there's a category too of unaccompanied or separated children, and they themselves often have not made the decision either, but the adult has said, for your safety, we're going to put you out here and you go on ahead. So I'm just making that clear. And then statelessness is something totally different again. Because a child might be in a situation of migration doesn't necessarily mean that they're stateless, but that can happen as a result of the migration. So I just want to clarify that. And on the specific question though, migration across, we're thinking of the Caribbean region, and right now, the big issue that we have across the Caribbean in terms of migration are the children of Haiti. And that is an extremely worrying problem. They're literally being shut out of the Dominican Republic, who has brought in laws to say that the Haitian children must leave and go back to Haiti. And many of those children are not necessarily familiar with Haiti at all. They were probably, a lot of them, born in Santo Domingo to Haitian parents. And so we have to, that's a situation we have to resolve urgently. I met with a Bahamian delegation, and from where they're coming from, now they've got another problem. Their problem is that most of those families want to prefer the Bahamas as a stepping off point rather than other places. And obviously that's because it's next door to the United States. And they have a problem of not being able to absorb the large numbers. They're talking some days 900 persons wanting to go there. So I am proposing, and I'm hoping to sort of flesh it out, to borrow an idea from the European Union, where they met, as all countries, they agreed to do a prorating system among themselves and say, and I'm putting this, I would like to put this to CARICOM, agree how many of these children that you can absorb, and everyone pitch in and help the Haitians. But I know that's not the only migrants, but that's the one that is really seriously a problem at the moment. Now, in terms generally across the board, I am hoping to see a day when CARICOM accepts what a lot of countries as groups accept. And that is that within our group, you make sure that all, and I'm going to use migrant children because it's shorter, just for the time being, that come to us must be afforded all the benefits that our children have. So say, for example, in Barbados, our children have free education right through to university. It is compulsory up to the age of 16. We're hoping to push that to 18. Now, what we argue is that every child should have those benefits because one, accepting the point that children themselves are there because they're brought there, it's not their doing. And two, you do not want to create an underclass. You don't want to create a classroom where some children have benefits and some don't. And therefore, you want to have a cohesive society as far as children are concerned. And but I know I'm telling you up front, I've been pushing this idea and it's a sticking point. A lot of governments say, oh, we can't necessarily afford this. My argument is it has to be a multilateral quid pro quo. Your children come to us, we provide the education, ours go to you. And, you know, if we look at as Caribbean nationals, we have migrated around the world ourselves. And we have a lot of our children, for example, have benefited from the social services in Canada or in the United Kingdom or wherever we immigrate. So why not accept that within your own region, you should be able to extend these benefits to children? You have hit on one of the topics on which I'm very passionate about again.
I see that, Ms. Harris. I think the lexicology is quite important. The language we use to describe children is quite important. We have to unpack that and how children choose. If children can even choose their vulnerability and abuse is quite important. I also think the accessibility and what does nations think about children having access, and the politics of accessibility is also something that you raised. I want to go to Ms. Harrison to ask, in her office where she sits, what does the migrant issue look like and that response?
All right, so at present, we do not have a significant migrant crisis per se. We have been seeing, however, particularly along the southern border, Clarendon, particularly that parish, where we have had some Haitians who have come across. And the issues, as Mrs. Marshall Harris has so very eloquently put, are issues that we really have to consider very carefully and treat with them very seriously. One of the things that I'd like to highlight, though, is that any child who is in a situation of migration, apart from not having had any participatory contribution to that decision, they are automatically at heightened risk. They are more vulnerable. And if I'm to put on my human trafficking hat for a bit, what we find is that the vulnerabilities that attach to these children and their families make them even more heightened prospects for falling prey to human trafficking for a number of different reasons. Parents, for example, may see it as a very viable option of bringing an income to the family and may themselves participate in offering these children up for exploitation. And where you do not have families who are so actively participating in that process, you have children when they get to a particular age, and the prime age for human trafficking victims in Jamaica is anywhere between 15 to say 17, because they're feeling the financial crunch of their families. They opt to seek greener pastures and become embroiled in a trafficking experience. And so all of the services, for example, that Mrs. Marshall Harris spoke to just now, it's so important to have them properly grounded, properly exposed, and really infused in teaching and learning environments. If they have passed the age of going to school, so to speak, in Jamaica, our act says, you know, you have to be in school up until 16. We do have many other children, however, who surpass that. But you can understand that a migrant child may not be so motivated or may not have the access. So the question is, what kind of skills training can these youngsters be involved in to ensure that we're giving them the capacity to earn, thereby lessening the temptation to go into an exploitative situation? And so the crisis that really is there is a presumptive one, because we have to assume that if you're a child in a migratory situation, that's not planned, that's not orderly, that's not, you know, you're not coming with parents who are perhaps well-adjusted and going to join a workforce, but it is a transitional movement because your family is running from some hardship or is looking for greener pastures. we have to assume that the services that have to be available to these children and families must be so expansive to prevent the temptation and the heightened risk of really having those vulnerabilities that they're exposed to take root. So those are the additions that I'd like to add. If I may just comment very quickly as well, a thought came into my head as I heard my colleagues speak, and it's one that I want to emphasize, that apart from the exposure to violence and all these things that we speak about, children predominantly, I think, throughout our region are not seeing the manifestation of their right to participate in decisions that impact their lives in a very real way. And so even with this migration crisis, as you have said, Mrs. Marshall-Harris, they often don't say, oh, mom, let's migrate to Jamaica or Trinidad. And in everyday discussions that impact their lives, we're not seeing a systemic approach either in the home or at the national level where we actually give children a platform to routinely contribute to decisions of national importance that impact their own lives. Thank you.
And Matthew, anything on that? I think there's a really good segue into protection systems. But Matthew, anything on your end?
Yeah, so I think my contribution will also kind of start to segue into protection systems. So definitely echoing the statements of my fellow panelists. A couple points that I wanted to kind of stress on that really resonated with me is that, yes, so of course, something we're all saying is that during these migratory processes, a child's participation is very limited to oftentimes not at all. And I want to contextualize that because Marcus, what you had said really early on in this discussion was this kind of the layered approach. What is it like for the migrant child, or what is it like for the family, and then for the communities as it goes? I want to really center our language in the fact that for the majority of children going through this type of process, it is a traumatic event. And it is because of the fact that the systems that are typically present within childhood to build that resilience, they are the ones that they are losing. Those are the systems they are losing. So a lot of the times when we get really deep into the working with these vulnerable populations that are on the move, we find that children are expressing things like, I don't have my favorite stuffed toy anymore. My best friend was next door and I can't speak to her anymore. And so when we think of good practices for mental health and for resilience, we're thinking social structures, routines, developmental milestones, and those things are not what parents would consider, and rightfully so in an emergency. It's not what is considered in an emergency. So those items are often left behind, those connections are left behind, and you are left with a child attempting often to kind of pick up those pieces themselves. And it is often because what we know as well about the family system in an emergency is that survival mode does kick in. So the parents are very focused, again, rightfully so, on access to food, access to cash, access to travel, and access to safety. But that safety becomes reductive to physical safety. And so things like the child's ability to speak up in the household, having the child have somewhere where they could go and play with other friends, those are things that are not on the priority list, but we understand are very developmentally impactful for children. And so it's about finding out how we can build better systems where, these are situations that, of course, we want to be very sensitive towards, and there are a lot of political factors, but at the end of the day, when we think of children, we want to prioritize their protection and their safety. Something that we have done within Trinidad and Tobago that we consider to be a very strong best practice is that we noticed that a lot of these systems to respond to these kind of migratory situations, they were not fully prepared, be it because they had not been tested or utilized, or even just really kind of fully thought out. And so we have established, and I guess this would be the term that Mrs. Marshall-Harris was talking about. What we would do as a children on the move, working groups and working spaces and collaboratory spaces, and then building and focusing on system strengthening rather than just an emergency response. So because we recognize that, like I said earlier, if 1 in 3 children are in poverty, but a significantly small amount of, and those would be nationals, are in national social protection and social policy systems, then it is not a matter of adding on a migratory situation. It is a matter of strengthening the system as a whole, because it does mean that there are locals or nationals and non-nationals within a country that require the same support. And while the level of sophistication or severity may differ, our stance is very much that the stronger we can respond as a Caribbean is the more resilient that we can, the more resilient children that we can put forward.
I think that was really thought-provoking, especially around what we hear from Ms. Marshall Harris around the culture of the power between adult and child, and now hearing from you, Ms. Harrison, around the lack of child participation. And we see how it's difficult to have children participate if we live in a culture where adults are the ones who make decisions and exclude the idea of seeing children as humans and humanizing. I think you do an excellent job of humanizing children, Matthew, by allowing us to see that they need their favorite toy and they miss their friends and their food, and moving does something to their psyche. And I'm really seeing this, the benefit of having this interdisciplinary, not only multi-stakeholder, but also interdisciplinary. We're seeing the benefits of the history coming here. We're seeing the benefits of the protective system. We're seeing the benefits of the psychosocial as we understand children in their multiple layers. Now, I want to go into protection systems, and I want to start outward in, international in. So I'm going to ask Ms. Harris, Ms. Marshall Harris, to tell us about what has the international community said and prepared and organized, and the mechanisms for us to think about child protection systems. And then I want to go into specifically the Jamaican Advocacy Office, what that looked like, what the establishment of that looked like, what the advocacy around getting it established looked like, and its functionalities. So I'll start with Ms. Marshall Harris in terms of what the international community and the international mechanisms have done for us to think about child protection.
Right, we have quite, it would take me most of this week, I think, to start to describe what we've constructed in terms of child protection. But basically, we require every state, and as you know, that the CRC is the most ratified convention. 196 countries have ratified it. And we require all those countries to, well, report to us every 5 years. Now it's probably going to an 8-year cycle because we are not been managing the 5-year cycle. But when they report to us, there's certain questions that we require them to answer for us. And one of the most important is what systems have you set up for protecting your children? In other words, we ask them to outline the entire strategy for ensuring that children are not abused, that and we go through all the rights and making sure that they have a right to life, survival, that they are in every instance protected along the way. And we require that as one of the first things we require is tell us your plan. In other words, we require you to give us a national plan which sets out all of these elements. One of the most important things that we require, which I'm very happy to see that, you know, Jamaica's way ahead and has done, is to ensure that you have an independent advocate, an entire structure which says to children, you have a place to come to. You can apply to us. We are going to look out for your interests. We're going to give you a platform to tell us how you feel. By the same token, we're going to use what you tell us in your best interest to create a world for you. And that's really what we want every country to do, to have that mechanism that children can say, what's going on with me, what's wrong, what's good, and how what we feel can make it better. The other thing that we require is, apart from ensuring that they can be heard, is to say that in every respect, every country must have a system in place that whatever the matter is that's going to be dealt with, whether it's by court, administrative authority, that the best interest of the children is foremost. It has primacy. And that we feel protects, if you understand that whatever you're doing, the child's best interest comes first, then that protects them considerably. So, and just to give it a real life example, because a lot of people don't accept this. If two parents are divorcing, very often they think it's about them. And what we say, in fact, it isn't, you know, it's more about the children and what is to happen to them. And you have to take them into consideration. You've got to listen to their view, and you've got to operate in the administrative authority or the court should operate in their best interest. So I don't know, I may be making your concept of protection wide, but that's how we see protection. That if there's this construct, you begin to protect children in every sphere of their lives. And so if we wanted to specifically speak of abuse, for example, we require every country to have laws that set out child protection. What happens to the child who's neglected? What is going to be the response? What the state is going to do in terms of providing help, and who does it. We also, if a child has been sexually abused, we require states to set out what is the protocol for reporting that abuse, drawing it to the attention, and what happens thereafter in terms of investigating it. We also require legislation. We don't just want it in terms of practice, we want actual legislation. And beyond legislation, we want the legislation implemented, not just have words on paper. And because we want to create a system where there's a go-to. Everybody can go to that, it's codified, set down, this is what happens to a child in every instance. Now, let me just add this, because I recognize that other people to speak. Let me just add this, that the real danger that I am finding though, is that people do not understand that a lot of the protective mechanisms have been in place in practice. To a greater or lesser extent. Not the state always has, apart from CRC or anything else, has always been parens patriae. The state could always intervene and say, I'm going to look after this child because they need the protection of the court. So when we ask for protection systems, people get worried, but the point is that what we're doing is codifying and putting into best practice what is there and what we're refining. And I wish in the Caribbean they would begin to understand. I think I should make Jamaica an exception, because I noticed that Jamaica has really gone way ahead of us in terms of the child protection. So I don't want to include Jamaica here, because we at the CRC recognize the strides that Jamaica has made, but in the rest of the Caribbean, I want them to understand that child protection is about protecting your junior citizens who are going to become your adult citizens, and until they're protected, you're not saying anything. Okay.
Yes, and as we leave Geneva and New York, we come now global south to Jamaica, which has one of the, if not the only, child-centered child rights institution establishment. And I can tell you this, Ms. Gordon Harris, that I think Ms. Marshall Harris, Ms. Harrison, and Ms. Marshall Harris knows that for several decades, the region has been calling for similar mechanisms. In Trinidad and Tobago, in 1997, a report called for a children's ombudsman. in the most recent 2021 child abuse investigation called for a children's commissioner. And I know other parts of the world have been asking for similar style institution. So I know, Ms. Gordon Harrison, that your work goes beyond just child protection. Child protection is one element of the work that you do. In my work, I say safeguarding because it talks about a philosophy of how we see and view children. And I know your establishment does safeguarding work, including protection, but I want to hear, how did it start? How did you get to where you are? And what does that operationality looks like, that functionality, what does that look like?
All right, so thanks for that, Marcos. So it all started when Jamaica ratified the UNCRC in 1991. And we realized as a country that we couldn't just ratify and stay static. We had to now start to see how we could give legs to the convention within the context of Jamaica and what we were doing to protect and really enhance the rights of children. Because like most other territories, we traditionally had a very paternalistic approach to children. So we were part of the welfare era, where we looked out from our positions of adulthood, what was right for children. So it was more in an objectifying kind of way. And then with the CRC becoming a ratified convention by Jamaica, making us a state party, we realized that we had to almost jump to this rights-based approach, seeing children as rights holders with entitlements in their own right, and seeking to almost revolutionize how we did matters across the board. So putting the best interest principle at the center of all decisions that impact children, and at the same time, not confusing best interest with rights, but recognizing these individual rights as articulated under the CRC. And so there was a lot of lobbying, civil society, stakeholders who really had been working in child protection and who had been a friend of child protection systems said, you know, what are we going to do? How do we galvanize our efforts? And so we had, for example, our local legislation, which was the Child Care and Protection Act, that really married a number of the principles exposed in the CRC and really gave them legislative legs within the Jamaican legal framework. And one of the provisions of the Child Care and Protection Act said that there should be a children's advocate, and that children's advocate should be independent, so shouldn't report to a minister and, you know, fall under any ministerial authority, but really should be a commission of parliament that has the legislative authority to go wherever a child needed his or her right to be advanced or best interests to be safeguarded. And so the act was passed in 2004. And with such a provision, agitators said, all right, we have the provision, we have the framework, where's the office? And so this led to the office coming to being in February of 2006, 2 years later after the passage of that legislation. And in terms of how the office is framed, it's very interesting because while we do child protection, it's really through safeguarding lenses, as you have said, and legal lenses. So we're not, for example, running and operating children's homes and so on, but from where we sit, we are a critical component of what I call the accountability framework, which to me is very, very instrumental if you're going to have a system that doesn't operate with impunity. So yes, it's good to have facilities where children are given food and housing if they don't have parents who are doing that. Yes, it's good to say we have a foster care system and we have adoption services. But when the adoption services are not operating effectively and efficiently, and thereby compromising the rights of the children who are to be adopted because it's very prolonged and protracted, or where we have children's homes, where children continue to be violated, which to me is, it cuts to the core, because for me, we have rescued these children and put them in a facility. And when they're in a facility and they're being violated, that to me is trauma upon trauma. And so if you don't have this accountability framework, which is what the Office of the Children's Advocate does, to investigate the other players in the child protection sector and to hold them accountable, to say, you say you're doing this, but how are you really doing it? That to me elevates the child protection sector to another level, which we really need to aspire to. That, however, is not to say that the system operates without its challenges. We have culture, which continues to be a debilitating factor, if you will, in some instances. I've heard, for example, but you're a Commission of Parliament, which means that you are a government employee. How can you expose what's going on in a government facility if we're all on the same side? And that takes me back to something that Mrs. Marshall Harris said earlier in this dialogue. And it has to be that we recognize as players in whatever sector of the child protection framework that we operate, that there's no loyalty that should exist to people. The loyalty should exist to the oath and the commitment that you took to protecting and advancing the rights and the best interests of the children in each situation. So yes, it's unfortunate that what you may do may impact a stakeholder of long-standing. But if that stakeholder of long-standing needs to be held accountable because his or her actions or inaction are prejudicing the rights of a child or operating negatively to his or her best interests, then if we're true to that mantra, it just has to be done. And so that continues to be, I think, one of the biggest challenges for an office like mine. And bit by bit, you know, we are different, we're trailblazing, but we are challenged. And so the call that has been made across the region for these institutions to be instituted is a call that I endorse. And I say the quicker the better, because then once you're in place, you now have to find a way to navigate through this culture that says, yes, you must push, but not against everyone. And so if we're going to really transform our protective system throughout the region, where it is not driven by personality and faces, but really driven by the purpose and the principle that operates or should operate in a well-oiled child protection system, start on the journey now, because you have quite a road ahead of you in terms of chipping away at the culture that is pervasive of, we know each other, so let's deal with it a particular way.
As moderator, I'm going to beg leave just to jump in here quickly, because I know that Ms. Harrison is going to, it may not be able to respond later. But I want to say I congratulate you, Jamaica, for having established this. And let me say that this is exactly the organization we need based on what they call the Paris Principles, which says that it has an independence of action and direction and objective, independence of the state, where you can even call the state to account. Interestingly, I want to point out that a number of the countries that we deal with do have children's commissioners. In fact, the rest of the Caribbean, can I tell you, are late to the game, because, you know, it's become almost normative in many, many countries to have the role that you perform. And I do not understand why I cannot bring the rest of the Caribbean into this era where you have these independent bodies that says, this hasn't got anything to do with which party is now in power. This has nothing to do with, you know, what set of individuals are the authority. This has to do with promoting the rights of a particular segment, in this case, children. And so, I mean, I congratulate you all for getting there. And I'm hoping that the rest of the Caribbean will follow suit. They've been trying for a long time.
As I told Ms. Gordon Harris, she needs to start taking interns from other parts of the region and training them to do the advocacy work. And I think you've raised interesting ideas for us to think about, that pushback and resistance between independent and state, and how do we function within that, and how do we center children in monitoring and accounting for duty of care, right? I think that's so important. We have a question. It's for you, Ms. Gordon Harrison, and it's from the chat. It's from Lorenzo. Does the Office of the Children's Advocate have prosecution power?
We have legal and investigative powers. So what the legislation says is that we can institute proceedings in court, all proceedings excepting criminal proceedings. So what that looks like is where we have, for example, a government entity that we think has operated in a way that does not promote children's rights or has violated an identifiable best interest principle, is we can and we have instituted civil proceedings on behalf of the child who has been so violated. And the damages that we get in those cases, we take no fees, we hand them over to the child or hold them in trust until the child has attained the age of majority. Where we have done it in cases where the children have been deceased, that the damages go to the estate of the child, so the family gets the benefit of that. In relation to criminal matters, our investigators, in addition to doing investigations to support us in civil proceedings, we can also do investigations that mimic police investigations. And what we do in those particular cases is we stand in the shoes of the police investigator, record the statements, collect the evidence and all of that. And then once the file is compiled and sent to me, I will then say, based on my own legal experience and as a former senior director, deputy director of public prosecutions, are the charges that I see. And then I liaise with the director of public prosecutions. She confers the formal charges are agreed upon. And then I, through my office, reach out and contact the commissioner of police, who then assigns what I call an arresting officer, because we do not have the powers of arrest. The person is arrested, the matter is placed before the court. And so you will have two investigators giving evidence, the investigating officer, which comes from the Office of the Children's Advocate, and then the arresting officer who gives the formal bit of evidence about how the person was taken into custody or brought before the court.
Ms. Gordon Harrison, I have a question. I probably know the answer, but I think I need to hear you say it out loud. Does your office deal with all children matters in all institutions?
Yes and no. So we do not duplicate, for example, if the police are doing an investigation and the investigation is going very well, there is no need for us to duplicate that effort. But if it is that there is a default, then we can step in. We have had other matters as well where the victim says there is a perception that the accused knows police officers, has a brother who is in the force, and if my disclosure has to be made at a police station to a police officer, I'm not going to be participating in the prosecutorial process. And so in those instances, we would be the ones that would receive the disclosure and take it right through. But all that is needed to activate our jurisdiction is that the person who is in distress or who needs legal support or investigative support is someone who has not attained the age of 18 years.
I want to quickly bring in Matthew here as a clinician, someone working as well in the field. How important is it for supervision, accountability, and support from an institution similar to the Office of the Advocate? How important is that support? I think you do more than just accountability and monitoring and evaluating, Ms. Gordon Harris. I think you also do support to those institutions that may lack education, new knowledge, new exposures. I think that's also your role from what I've seen. But Matthew, how beneficial is it to have that support from that independent body for those who are doing the groundwork?
Yeah, so tremendously, in a nutshell. It is very important that we keep as much support that is indirectly and directly working its way towards our children as possible, right? And the reason for this is because it is important that we center these protective services because you never know where the crack is in the system, right? We understand that with childhood, that it is a tumultuous experience, that it is a lived experience for each individual, and that even when we think of what we would define, be it clinically or developmentally or even legally, what we might define as a traumatic event or a situation that, you know, a body is going to step in, what we do realize is that it depends a lot on how that person has responded to other things in the past, right? That each individual child and each system is going to be a little bit different. And so advocates are important across the board for children, for practitioners, for people that are actively working in the system. And something that I say quite a lot in my work, where we are providing first level response for child protection and psychosocial support for migrant kids, is that it is equally as important that the service providers understand the system and feel happy, supported, comfortable, and ethically confident in what they are doing at any point in time. Because there is a trickle-down effect in terms of how much support we bring to our children in a day-to-day life. And you know, at a larger level, it reminds me of a best practice that that recently happened. So last week, I want to say Thursday, there was the launch in Trinidad and Tobago of the National Interagency Protocol for Child Abuse Prevention and Management. And this is part, of course, coming out of a lot of those reports that we would have been following in terms of the investigation into the homes, into the different child protection systems. And this is one small step in that kind of direction. And the reason for that for us is because it is important to clarify, not just for the stakeholders and the actors within a system, but it is also important to clarify the system to the general public. Okay, so what is this body responsible for? And I think that helps us when I think back to the earlier concerns that I agree with, where we discussed kind of accountability and transparency through the lens of, okay, am I responsible as a government agency to the agency that I represent, or is my accountability back to my oath? And I think clarifying what roles and responsibility is allows the general public to hold these systems accountable, to understand where they direct complaints to, and to have independent oversight, overview, and to work a little bit better with all of us. Because again, when we look at the global trends, everyone is saying that they understand and appreciate things like abuse and violence towards children as significant issues. So it is often a matter of persons getting better guidance on how they can play a part in that system.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I think that was really interesting to hear that there is that need for that support system as it filters into the children who benefit from it. Ms. Faith Marshall Harris, I want to ask, from where you sit at CRC, what are some of the resistance to such mechanisms that you have observed in your practice coming from state institutions? So you've spoken about the cultural, but how does the personal become political in state decisions when it comes to children and this particular kind of independent accountability mechanism?
Right. Well, one of the first things that we can sometimes encounter is, and I mean, it might go back to culture again, but pardon me, I'm going to just tell you what are the chief barriers we find. And it is usually based on a public perception that the state is exerting too much power. They're trying to take on the role of parents. So you get a resistance and a pushback in some states that, well, you are now telling us how we are to treat our children, and therefore it is too much authority, it's too much state authority. So you get a pushback there. But one of the things that, and in our hemisphere in particular, and let me say this, I'm going to be very frank. In our hemisphere, our biggest problem is that although the United States, or probably because they're not signatories to the CRC, you find that a lot of what is happening in the United States is copied or mirrored. I think copied is a better word, in the Caribbean. So they have some problem at the moment brewing across the states that, you want to usurp with these protection systems, you're trying to give the children the right to, you know, get rid of their parental authority. And they have to resist it, so they're going to have a pushback on it. And that has been a problem in our hemisphere. It's not necessarily so across the world, but that is one of the things that I've observed in our hemisphere. And I think it's because of an influence, a US influence going on there. The another pushback that we're getting, and it will have to do with a confusion that develops about what is the UN. I don't know if you've found this in other countries, but we have to keep reminding people that the United Nations is nothing but a group of all nations, and that in fact, what the United Nations is not a separate thing and apart. So all that the United Nations has done is it's come together and decided on some best practices in relation to children. It is not necessarily imposing on anybody anything. We're just saying that these are the standards that we've observed are best for children. This is the thing. Now, another pushback that we're getting in terms of protection is economics. Because protection systems require a certain amount of budgeting to make them work. There's got to be an allocation and you've got to be able to ring fence that allocation, because you can't vote money to protect children this year and then cut it next year, or decide, well, we won't do that because the children are ever present. So we find that money can be an issue. There are people who say, well, the things that you want us to do in terms of protection mechanism costs too much and we are a poor country, whatever the excuse is. We want to allocate money differently. We don't want to spend it in this way that you're telling us to do. Another pushback that we're getting in terms of protection is the concept that a lot of states will not accept, that the child has an evolving capacity. So that you can't, what you need what has to be part of protection is accepting that this child is not going to remain, or should not remain in a static status forever. You are supposed to, this child has to mature, grow up, because you have to put an adult out into the world. You can't suddenly convert a 17-year-old into a mature adult one morning when they wake up and they're 18. So with the protections, mechanisms that we want, and we're trying to get people to understand that even within the protection, there must be that space to allow children to help you design their own protection. I hope I'm making sense. In other words, we're saying, yes, you have a protection system, but at the same time, you must allow your children who can already start to articulate and think. Let me give you an example of, I think, a practical example is what would work here. I just completed a review of the United Kingdom, and the most impressive part of that review was not the state party. It was the fact that 60 children came from across the United Kingdom, and they presented us with incredible presentations, is the only word, on how their different protections needed revising, what needed to happen, what changes should be made. It was, and I'm saying that once you empower your children to start giving you that input, you actually have a better system because they know what they need. But then you, as I said, on the other hand, we're getting a pushback from countries because they feel that you are now giving the children rights over and beyond what they feel you should have. The same adultism. And my final point in terms of pushback is a lot of states not recognizing that some of what they implement is actually in itself negating protection systems. And I speak now particularly of what they say the criminal justice system. A lot of what they have in place actually criminalizes children before they're really criminal. And that goes for a lot of countries. I wouldn't single out any right now, but we have another thing that they tell me is, but where these children have rights, but where are their responsibilities? And you know that we don't believe that children have responsibilities. I know that sounds like a lot of people go crazy when you say that, but we believe that children have rights, parents have responsibilities, and children will grow into responsibilities at 18. But they don't, there's not a quid pro quo. They don't have to, what we say is that they don't earn their rights by doing anything. They have the rights. And but we can debate this, because you may not agree with us, but we do not believe that children have responsibilities in the term of responsibilities, but we can say, here are standards that we would like you to live by, and that is discipline and guidance. And so that's what I'm just saying, that's the kind of language and discourse we have where states are not happy with what we say you should be doing to protect children.
Thank you for showing us the sort of dichotomy of what works and what has been given resistance to. I think that that is helpful for us here in the region who, not you Jamaica, us here who are now trying to develop such mechanisms. And I will come back to you later in terms of how we could use the space in which you sit at as a way to get this thing rolling. But I have a question for you, Ms. Gordon Harrison, from one of the participants, the viewers. How widely is interest of the child defined? Does it include ensuring that as children are moved around, ensuring that they get access to school so that their education is not interrupted? And I think this is about practice now, like what spaces get a kind of attention. So we're questioning what access to education and your role and your office can contribute to, really, yeah.
All right, so we look at each case individually, and the merits of each case determine the definition of best interest. So we're looking comprehensively at the child who is at the center of the response that we're giving. So for instance, if a child has to be relocated because of whatever the family circumstance is, and that child is now moved from mom to dad, for instance, a different parish and so on, our office is very central in the discussions with the Ministry of Education and Youth in the particular region, for example, that the child is being transferred to ensure that there is enrollment in the school that is reasonably proximate to the new address, so that there is no interruption in education. In the same way, we look at what are the health needs of this particular child. What are the psychosocial needs? Do we need to be looking at ongoing counseling support? What really is the situation of the particular child, and how can we, from the various corners of those needs, converge into a space where we are facilitating coverage of those needs in a very practical way. So it's a very broad definition that is not bridled by having a specific terminology of words, for example, that say this is what best interest is. Because as Mrs. Marshall Harris has said, for example, the needs of a child evolves. It differs based on the circumstances at a particular time and what the reality is that the child is exposed to. So we don't like to have a particular formulation of words that, boxes us in as to what best interest is. If I could, with your leave, Marcus, as I see my other commitment bearing down on me, but I was very intrigued just listening to the contributions of the panel. And this whole dichotomy of parental rights and entitlements and ownership of their appendages versus children's rights and being individual persons who really have these entitlements is something that we've seen play out in a very real way. And like my colleague panelists, I'll just give you a little bit of an example from the work of the Office of the Children's Advocate. And that has to do with a burgeoning number of cases involving medical care and health intervention services for children, where I have found myself as children's advocate actually instituting matters in court to say that the child's right to life, the child's right to access medical support and health services in accordance with the child's needs are being sacrificed because a parent, for example, believes that the traditional medicine man, or obeah man as we call it in Jamaica, is the person that they wish to confer with at the expense of having the child perhaps die or having the situation complicated. Also, as far as religion and religious beliefs are concerned, we have seen parents who have a particular belief and they're not minded to go with traditional medicine, despite all of the assessment being done locally, regionally, and internationally. And then the child, who is 11 years old or 12 years old, has the ability to participate in the discussion, is not of the belief of the parents, wants to have the medical procedure, but the parents are withholding consent. And the fulcrum of those arguments is that the rights of the parent go insofar as they coincide with the best interest of the particular child and the circumstances at play, but where they start not being in support of the child's best interest, then this whole notion of parental right is really a dying notion, because the best interest principle and the right of the child is in fact supreme. And so I just wanted to contribute that to the discussion.
And before I get to Matthew, I just also want to know if you could also share, as an operating institution, what have you observed as pushback in terms of producing accountability reports and feedback? And because from my experience of doing the investigation, no one likes to hear where they're going wrong, but it's quite valuable. That's how we learn, right? We reflect on our shortcomings. But what are some of the pushbacks that you and backlash that you have gotten from where you sit, and what we could learn from that?
Okay, so generally, I think anyone who does this kind of work has to be prepared to an extent to be unpopular. Unpopular if you have to deal with a decision that doesn't find favor with how things are usually done. And so I'd prefer that word unpopular versus backlash, because quite frankly, regardless or despite what anyone may say, I don't see it as backlash, because I don't even focus on it. I just see it as par for the course. It's because I'm doing something and we're doing something as an organization that's not necessarily popular. In terms of the cultural approach to what I'll call, for want of a better word, collegiality, you know, things happen, so we deal with it and we move on, and it's a part of how things operate. But here you have this accountability framework now through the Office of the Children's Advocate saying, we saw that, this is what we think of it, and this is how you need to fix it. And, you know, these are the child safeguarding principles, for example, that you are offending. And so we think that either you correct it or you move on, because this may not be a good fit. A very recent thing which I'll reference without calling the name specifically has to do with a report that I issued in December of last year against the primary government entity that deals with the operating of children's homes and facilities, and operating our foster care system as well in Jamaica. And suffice it to say, that engendered a lot of local debate. Some persons understanding the principled position, others thinking that there was perhaps another way. And, you know, sympathy should override the principle, so to speak. So that kind of cultural institutional response that, we tend to give because of it's the Caribbean. This is how we normally do things here. We'll just, say, okay, it's not so bad, but let's not go all the way to hold persons to account. So it's something that will continue. And I think anyone throughout the region, and I look forward to my counterparts coming forward in the region to have institutions like Jamaica, and not just coming forward, but sincerely, I certainly would like to be a part of assisting to develop those systems and working with colleagues, because I believe that as a region, we're so rich in terms of our experience. It's just to harness it and to see how best we can move forward, in unison and as a force that really operates on principle. But anyone, and for persons who will come forward, you have to be prepared for the unpopularity, what may be perceived as backlash. But as I said, if we are guided by the principle and why it is we are doing what we're doing, then the backlash doesn't even feel like backlash, because the underdog, who is the child that you're advocating and whose voice you're amplifying, is in fact being best served.
Yes, I think that is lessons learned for sure for the region. I just came back from the UK, and so many countries in Europe, they even have a European ombuds person, associate network, right? And I could see how that would so be vital to the establishment and safeguarding of children in the region. So we have this sort of collective understanding of the region's children, and we share. I can't wait to see something like that in this part of the world. In the US, every state, every county within that state has either a child's advocate, a children's ombudsman, a commissioner, because they center children within the conversation. And I want to go to Matthew, and in my work, this power dynamic between adult and child that we have been discussing, and it's quite clear exists. I challenge it by children participatory methodology as a way we get people to understand young people, children, and get them involved in the processes. From where you sit, how do you see yourself and UNICEF and the agencies you work with mobilizing children, their experiences, their voices to challenge these power relationships where children are undervalued, especially some children who their innocence and vulnerability aren't even considered. Given our colonial context, a lot of children, vulnerability and innocence aren't even considered at age 9 and 10 and 14, just because they come from other parts of the world, just because their bodies and their skin look different. How does your agency mobilize children, and what does that work look like?
Yeah, okay, so that is a great question, because I think it gives us a lot of room for where we are going as a region, which I think is the theme that we are hearing in terms of, we've discussed a lot of the challenges that come out of doing this work, and the way that the public or members of the community or parents tend to have these types of reactions. As it relates to the power dynamic, of course, we take systems-based approaches, so we often work at varying levels to try to create that cultural shift and that cultural change. Oftentimes the discourse in and around power levels, for me as a practitioner of mental health, it is very much that and when we work in MHPSS and community settings, we do a lot of that kind of what we would call psychoeducational work with families and parents, those direct parenting courses, building out ideas like positive behavioral management, which is one of our dominant strategies that we work on, and one of our best practices in terms of something that UNICEF endorses in a very strong way. And this idea that, it's really about understanding and getting people to understand the impacts that violence might have, and even just that feeling of powerlessness might have on a child, and what it looks like in adulthood. So oftentimes what I have found works well is really helping people to reconnect to initial experiences of that powerlessness in their own lives. I think in the Caribbean, to directly call it out, we have this tough it up mentality. We have this idea that, well, I was, I wasn't afforded this as a child, or my parents would not have allowed that. And so I don't really understand how you can tell me that this practice that I was raised with is in fact a harmful practice or is doing anything to this child, because I am okay as an individual, right? And while of course we want persons to not necessarily feel bad about themselves, we also want to open their eyes to what that impact looks like. So something that often works really well is, drawing attention to some of the work that we've seen on the way that development is impacted by things like fear and by things like feelings of powerlessness and the actual medical realities that we see. So what we do know is that a child who experiences significant or frequent fear is actually at risk for the brain itself shrinking, and their ability as an adult to respond to situations, to respond to emergencies, to act and connect with people is actually limited because of that initial developmental challenge. And so a lot of times when we're doing, again, that community work, it's getting people to understand that it may not be this one instance, is not necessarily make or break, but is this a risk that I am willing to take as an individual in my engagement with children? Is this something that is putting that child on the best path forward? Or is this something that is running a risk that is something I wouldn't necessarily do if I was thinking it through in that way, if I felt more emotionally regulated in the moment, or whatever it is that kind of leads to that dynamic that we see, where oftentimes not only are children powerless, I think that powerlessness is then aggressively reinforced. And I think that's where we see a lot of the challenges coming forward, where children know that they are powerless in the dynamic. They understand that from very young because we work really hard as a society to reinforce it. And something I like to use as an example for that is that in a lot of countries, and at least especially in Trinidad and Tobago, for example, public spaces that children can go to after school are very, very limited. You will see security guards barring the entrance for children in secondary school uniforms. Police are a little bit more aggressive with what they are doing on the streets. And so we are building a society for everyone, but ignoring about a third of our population. So they are well aware that they are powerless, but then that powerlessness is kind of reinforced on them through our language, our actions, our policies. And so they're kind of bombarded every which way that they go with constant reinforcements of the fact that they don't have these rights. So of course, what we do as well is at education levels and direct contact with children, we do work with them to understand and better understand their rights and who they can go to in these situations. We have two really, really interesting concepts that I would love to talk about, because I think the more people that are able to provide this to children and are aware of it is the better. So we have U-Report, which is a global UNICEF initiative to get persons, to get young children and young people involved. So you can sign up as a child to become a U-Reporter, and those polls run regularly asking children on their input as it relates to climate change, to issues within their country, to environmental disasters, and it allows them to be participatory, but also to be able to participate, but it also shows them how that participation leads to change within their culture. So they will get access to things like, okay, well, 70% of you said that these are priority issues in your community. Now let's work on what that could look like as a solution. What do we do with that action and how do we promote it? And then the second thing that is really, really interesting that UNICEF has been working on is we have an app available for children. It's called the My Child Helpline app. It is available in only a couple of the countries that we cover right now, but it is something that we are working to scale up across the entire region. So it's available in Trinidad and Tobago, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, in Antigua and Barbuda and Barbados, as well as Grenada. And this My Child Helpline app is a MHPSS child protection tool. So parents and children are encouraged to, going through all the necessary safeguards, install this onto the parent's phone or the child's phone if they are old enough for something like this. But the app allows them to access all the national toll-free helpline numbers in their specific country. It supports them by accessing live chat features and telecounseling services where available in the country. And then for the children, of course, they can choose their avatar. They can search by location. So if they say, I am in this particular region of a country, it will show them where the national child-related services are near to them. So they can by themselves kind of understand what is in and around their community to keep them safe. And then from a mental health perspective, it allows them to access a mood tracker, a password-protected diary, view information on children's rights. So it will list in a child-friendly format what their rights are and who they can go to. And then it is currently available in English, Spanish, Dutch, and French. And there's like an interactive game corner as well, so that it's something that, the children and the young people might actually want to utilize. And those are two of the big ways that we've been scaling and leveraging technology to try to support a more intersectoral approach across the ECHA region.
Could I
Just quick interjection, Ms. Marshall Harris. I know Ms. Gordon Harrison has to leave soon, and you're muted, Ms. Gordon Harrison. And if anyone wants to ask a question to Ms. Gordon Harrison, I think now is the time to quickly get it out. But I also want to ask, and as you give your last comments, is there a child advisory committee attached to this office? What does that look like, and how is it beneficial and important for children to have access, not just in receiving services, but to be part of the make-up of the org chart, the organizational development, and to center children within that beyond just receiving services, if it is part of your dynamic or consideration for your dynamic.
Yes, so it's something that we recognized very early on in the game, that we can't be championing children's rights and all the different category of rights, including their right to participate, and not have a mechanism that facilitated that particular participation. And so there is a children's advisory panel that we caucus with, and that panel is really made up of children who are from all walks of life, upper, middle, lower income, rural, urban, and we have to actually thank COVID for the rural bit, because because my office is based in the capital, which is Kingston, we had children from Kingston and St. Andrew and St. Catherine, and we had perhaps 2 persons from St. Thomas. But with the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic, which really taught us some very good lessons in using virtual platforms, we've been able to expand that scope beyond those parishes that are in the corporate area and near to. And so we recognize that children do have a voice, and we share with them topical issues to get their views. What do you think about so-and-so? Or what are some of the issues coming out of your community that you have observed that you want to say something about? We have done newspaper specials in Child Month, for example, which is celebrated in Jamaica in May, which has very serious issues that we channel the voices of children on. They write their pieces, we facilitate it being published in the national newspaper. We have also said to them when we are launching any particular programs, we want you to help us to tell us, how should this look? How should it feel for it to be engaging and to really connect with children who are our ultimate stakeholders as far as we're concerned? And even, for example, with the crafting of Safe Spot, which is Jamaica's National Child and Teen Helpline, we had focus groups with children, including members of our Children's Advisory Panel, to say, we have heard of many a helpline, but tell us what this one needs to look like to ensure that children will actually use it. And it was their inclusion, for example, that caused us to include WhatsApp as a means of not only them reaching out to us, but training our counselors and psychologists to provide psychosocial support via WhatsApp. So we know if a child reaches out by WhatsApp or by direct message on Instagram or Snapchat, our counselors have been trained to provide that support. They helped us to design the logo, what colors should be in it, and so on. So from peripheral issues, in terms of look and feel of programs to national issues that impact them. We use the Children's Advisory Panel as a vehicle through which to hear from them and to ensure that we are reflecting their positions when we speak from our platform as to what children actually do want and need.
So the region has potential, absolutely. The center children. A couple of questions for you quickly. I mean, you could answer as brief as possible. One is, do you have oversight of children resident supervisory ratio? So that kind of standard operating procedure. Is your office in charge of that?
Okay.
Mhm.
As about to say, not on a day-to-day basis, the government entity that is responsible for operating children's homes, they have a monitoring framework where they have what we call monitoring officers who have a supervisory role to play in relation to what's happening on the ground. Where we would get in is we have, through our office, a division called the Investigations, Inspections and Compliance Unit. And that unit will go in terms of doing unannounced inspections and sometimes announced, just to ensure that the monitoring framework that exists under that government entity is in fact operating as efficiently as it should and in accordance with the principles. And if it's not, that's where we make recommendations as to what needs to change.
Okay, and that makes sense. Day-to-day, definitely not. That's not your task. But overall, yeah. And I think one more I will ask is somebody saying that they hear your definition of children's interests, but whose definition takes primacy? Is it influenced by age of the child, or whether he or she action of the parent or guardian contributed to the child now being part of the state system? I'm not sure if that question is clear to you. They're asking about how, in other words, what is your triage system might look like?
Okay, so it has to be, of course, taken into account the age and the maturity of the child. What's going on with this child? What are the child's views? What are the experiences that the child has endured? And from there, we then look at the surrounding circumstances, because again, it's very important to center the voice of the child and the experiences that he or she would have gone through, because he can best speak to that. Then, of course, we look at what role did the parents have to play? Is there a parent who is contributing to the child being in a situation that is not desirable? And if so, what needs to happen there? Is it that there are other circumstances that are causing a particular situation to be at play? But as I said, we are very nuanced in our approach, because we firmly believe that to determine best interest, first of all, we must recognize that every situation turns on its own merits. What's true for one 8-year-old isn't true for another 8-year-old. What's true for a 5-year-old is not true for a 15-year-old. So it's about looking holistically at all the attendant circumstances, and then objectively now, when we have those circumstances in a way that we properly understand what's happening, determine what would be the best course of action to ensure that the best outcomes can be guaranteed for the child in issue.
Yeah, from establishment to functioning to backlash and resistance to operations. Thank you so much.
Yes.
And I mean, thank you for all that you've added, and to the wide range of persons here. Lots of the persons here are in childcare protection work, so I know they'll benefit from this conversation. Absolutely. Miss Faith Marshall-Harris, I know you had a comment. All yours.
Yes, and I will slip away at a convenient time. Thank you. I'm really sorry I have to leave, but the bilateral dialogue is awaiting me. Yes, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave you too, because it is going very late in Geneva, Switzerland, and I have rushed here straight from Palais. I haven't really done anything else but sit here with you. But I just wanted to add one last thing. I wanted to suggest to UNICEF that they can add to what they do by facilitating bringing children from the Caribbean to the CRC for the various state reviews. I'll tell you that's one of the things that the Caribbean has been lacking, that many countries benefit from. But first of all, most of our countries are way behind and late with their reports. I believe Trinidad and Tobago hasn't reported in about nearly 10, 15 years.
Yeah, we're due this year, right, Miss Marshall-Harris?
You've been due long ago, 10 years ago, probably.
I think we're submitting this year, if I may defend.
Yeah, it's not defensible, actually. And a number of countries, just like Trinidad and Tobago, are way behind, and within the next 2 years, they ought all to be presenting. But where the Caribbean has not benefited, where many countries do, is having a contingent of children who travel to Geneva and sit down with the committee and say, okay, you're going to get the state party view of things. You're going to get a report that says, oh, we've done this and we've done that and how wonderful we are. But here are the children. This is how things are really going. This is what we would like. This is what needs to happen. And I would very much like to see UNICEF get into that, because you don't have to bring a large crowd. I mean, the bigger countries do tend to be able to do quite a bit more, but even if it's just 3 or 4 articulate children from each country as they present the report, they help us to create the sort of concluding observations that are meaningful for the children, because they go directly to the thing. This is what is not happening for us in our country, and this is what we would like to see happen. And I can assure you that our committee treat those children's meetings, as we call them, with great priority. They, we turn out for them, we sit and we listen and we engage with the children, don't matter where they're from. And make careful note, and we try every question that the children ask us to ask the state party, we make sure we do ask, and we hold them to account. Which means that I'm saying that all the systems are really designed by children, because we've taken on board everything that they've said. So I want to say to UNICEF, add that to your armory for designing what children need. Thank you.
I think, Ms. Marshall-Harris, you are not saying anything new. I think if we borrow from the women's movement and CEDAW, and we see that sort of mobilizing of women's issues and young girls to present to CEDAW, it has been something that states and people have been thinking about. I just see the absence of children in their spaces, which is CRC, and you're quite right that we need to have them in those spaces. But it has been done before, and it's not new to the thinking of the region. So it's quite interesting that we haven't been doing it more. So I'm glad you said it out loud. Matthew, you were going to say something as we wrap up.
Yeah, so I just wanted to respond to Mrs. Marshall-Harris and say that is a fantastic tool to have in our armory. And I heavily hear you on and appreciate how much emphasis the committee is placing on those voices. And I will definitely raise it with the rest of the team to see whether or not that has been considered and whether or not it can be considered. I know that we have and continue to support a lot of the child rights ambassador programs or similar programs across some of the Caribbean states. And I am already thinking that those are systems that we can begin to think a little bit more about how we make them sophisticated, connected, and thus able to really approach what you are suggesting as a great step forward in keeping that dialogue centered where it needs to be and really hearing from the persons who need to be contributing to this discussion the most.
Could I just point out that when you say there's nothing new, I'm saying I am aware that CEDAW and CRPD and the other treaty bodies do have participation from the rights holders in each case. What I'm saying to you is that I find that in the Caribbean, we have not used that space for children. In other countries, they have been. And what I'm introducing to UNICEF is the idea that we need to use that space for children as well.
I think that is an excellent recommendation, Ms. Marshall-Harris, as to how we continue to do this work and to utilize the mechanisms put in place. Are there any closing comments from the panelists as we wrap up? I thank you for your time in advance, and at the end, I mean, Geneva is what, 6 hours ahead, Ms. Marshall-Harris?
Yes, it is.
It's 6 hours, so it's past your bedtime.
No, not quite, but I just do have some other stuff I have to get
Yes,
done for
absolutely.
tomorrow.
Respect the commitment and service.
But thank you very much for the opportunity to be able to articulate some of the concerns I have in terms of the Caribbean region, because I think that we are somewhat on the back foot when it comes to realizing children's rights. And I have a lot of work to do. The trouble is that when I'm there, I'm only there for 2 or 3 months before I come here again. But I am hoping in the next month or so to mount quite a platform of advocacy, because Barbados has just introduced a child protection legislation and nobody understands why we need it. This has got me completely bold. I don't know how we get to this place where people do not think that our children need protection. So I have a lot of advocacy to do when I get there.
And we thank you for your energy and your intellectual property and bringing back those experiences and sort of collating it palatable for us who are trying to do the work and who want to understand more and what can be done. I think you have really shaped a different kind of Caribbean child advocacy thinking today. I really thank you for that. Matthew, any closing remarks?
Of course. So thank you, Marcus. I will start by thanking everyone. I talk quite a lot, and I think it's always nice to have people so enraptured and participating, not only my fellow panelists, but also I could see that the chat was just very active with persons who are passionately engaging around this topic. I think when we think about the future and the way forward, we always talk about this idea that child protection or child abuse prevention and all of these different things, that they are everybody's business, right? That they are the responsibility of not just the direct stakeholders, not just the parents and caretakers, but us as a society. But what I always like to kind of invert for persons, and I think we did touch on it today, is that when we think about this idea of it takes a village to raise a child, I like to kind of flip that a bit and remind persons that we started out with this. They're not an appendage. So the child is not a production of the village that the village holds separate from itself and says, look, we created this model child. The child is a part of the village. The child is actively shaping the process, and we are actively shaping the child in a constant back and forth balance. And so it's critical that we think as broadly as possible, from the littlest type of participation, from their ability to participate in consumerism, from their ability to participate in discussions, all the way up to direct legislation and advocacy. They are the village itself. And it's important that we think of it in that way, and we shift that idea that they're an extension of another person or an object to be created until, as Ms. Marshall-Harris had been saying, until they are 17 and then they wake up at 18. So I think that is my biggest takeaway from today, and that's what I wanted to kind of reflect back to the participants today, that what really resonated for me was that idea that, we are shifting constantly away from this concept that a child is separate and apart, and is rather part of the village itself.
Thank you so much for that sort of reflective work, especially for someone who's on the ground and doing the practical work and putting into practice some of the things that we think and conceptualize. So thank you so much, Matthew, and your agency for the work that you do. I want to thank Sewell for allowing me to chair, to sort of moderate this conversation. This has really set a new tone in how we see Caribbean children and Caribbean responses. And I thank Sewell for giving us the opportunity to come together as Caribbean people to understand Caribbean children. And I will hand you back over to Dillis. There we go. To Dillis to take us to the end.
Yes. All right, thank you so much, Marcus. So it's my simple task to invite folks to complete our poll, which is now on our screen. And of course, this is going to be helpful in us shaping future webinars. On behalf of Sewell, I express gratitude to all the presenters, to you, Marcus, for moderating the session and taking us carefully through the entire discussion. To the panelists, Mrs. Faith Marshall Harris, thank you so much. We know we've stretched your day and we really appreciate that you've taken the time to contribute to this webinar on a well-needed discussion around child protection and child rights in the Caribbean. Through the discussion today, we recognize the complexity of child rights and protection, but critically the importance of respecting and protecting the rights of children. This necessary and timely discussion has highlighted important areas for action, but also areas for learning as we seek to ensure the care, safeguarding, and protection of our children is given the highest priority. So thank you again to everyone. John is asking to the poll, is the poll viewable? It says it's launched on my end. So I'm not sure. Great. So thank you again, everyone. We very much see these discussions as ongoing, and I'm sure we have another opportunity to delve deeper into this very important issue. And we thank you all for your time and for your sharing on this particular webinar. Have a great evening. Good night to you.